Some prisons were built to punish. Others were built to disappear people forever, far from any city, surrounded by freezing waters, battered by violent storms. There once stood a prison that many believed had only one exit: death. For decades, men tried everything. They carved tunnels with spoons, built rafts from stolen wood, bribed guards, pretended to be dead. Some even threw themselves into the sea, believing the ocean offered better chance than another day behind those walls. None of them came back. Or at least, that's what history tells us. Because hidden inside forgotten archives are stories that reveal what life was really like inside the prison built on an island where no one was supposed to escape. Tonight, we're going to uncover that forgotten history. History is filled with castles, fortresses, and prisons that became symbols of fear. But among them all, one stood apart. Not because it held the greatest criminals, not because it was the largest prison ever built, but because nature itself became part of its walls. The sea was its first guard. The cliffs were its second. The freezing tides became its final executioner. Generations believed escaping from this island prison was impossible. Yet desperate men never stopped trying. Some escape attempts became legends. Others disappeared so completely that even their names were erased. Today we're exploring the incredible true history of the island prison that challenged every escape attempt, the men who lived inside it, and why even now historians still debate whether anyone truly managed to escape. This is one of history's most astonishing forgotten stories. Long before a single prison cell existed, the island already inspired fear. Sailors avoided sailing too close to its rocky shores. Violent currents collided around its cliffs, creating unpredictable whirlpools capable of smashing wooden ships against the rocks within minutes. Dense fog rolled across the water without warning. Many captains believed the island was cursed. Others simply respected the sea enough to stay away. Its steep cliffs rose directly from the ocean, leaving almost no beaches where a boat could safely land. During storms, waves exploded against the rocks with such force that water climbed dozens of feet into the air. The wind never truly stopped. Winter transformed the island into a frozen fortress. Summer brought little relief. Fresh water was scarce. The soil was poor. Nothing about the island suggested people should live there, which made it the perfect place to imprison those society wished would never return. Military engineers quickly realized that nature had already built most of the defenses they needed. Walls could be constructed. Guard towers could be erected. Iron gates could be installed. But no architect in the world could design stronger barriers than freezing oceans and sheer cliffs. The island itself had become the prison long before the first prisoner ever arrived. Few could imagine that over the following decades, thousands of men would see these cliffs first, and often the last time. Many crossed those waters believing they would never again set foot on the mainland. For most of them, they were right. Once officials approved the island as the prison's future location, a new challenge emerged. Before anyone could be imprisoned there, someone had to build the prison itself. That meant transporting thousands of tons of stone, timber, iron, tools, food, fresh water, and workers across one of the most dangerous stretches of sea in the region. Every brick had to arrive by boat. Every beam had to survive rough waves. Every nail represented another journey through unpredictable waters. Construction quickly proved far more difficult than planners had imagined. Storms frequently interrupted deliveries for days, sometimes weeks. Barges carrying stone were forced to turn back. Others never reached the island at all after being damaged by violent seas. Workers often spent entire mornings waiting for the tide to calm before unloading supplies. Even after reaching shore, nothing became easier. There were no proper docks. Materials had to be hauled manually over jagged rocks and steep slopes before construction could even begin. Engineers knew the prison could never rely solely on the sea for protection. They designed massive stone walls capable of resisting cannon fire, harsh winters, and decades of saltwater erosion. Every cell block was positioned to eliminate blind spots. Guard towers overlooked every courtyard. Windows were intentionally small, limiting both light and hope. Heavy iron doors, reinforced with thick bolts, transformed each corridor into a maze of locked barriers. The builders also had to solve another problem: survival. Hundreds of workers would remain on the island for months at a time, requiring kitchens, storage buildings, workshops, wells, medical facilities, and temporary housing. Supplies arrived on carefully planned schedules because running out of food or fresh water could halt construction entirely. During severe weather, everyone simply waited, knowing the sea determined the pace of progress. As the prison slowly rose above the cliffs, sailors passing offshore began noticing its growing silhouette. At first they saw scaffolding. Later they saw towers. Finally, they saw an enormous stone fortress dominating the island, visible from miles away. It no longer resembled a construction site. It resembled a warning. Local fishermen started telling stories about the place before a single prisoner arrived. Parents frightened children by pointing toward the island and saying that anyone who broke the law would one day disappear behind those walls. Whether true or not, the prison was already becoming part of local legend. When construction was finally completed, officials proudly described it as one of the safest prisons ever built. They believed escape was no longer a matter of skill or determination. It had become a mathematical impossibility. A prisoner would have to defeat locked cells, armed guards, towering walls, freezing water, violent currents, and miles of open sea before reaching freedom. Few institutions in history inspired such confidence. Few would also inspire so many desperate attempts to prove that confidence wrong. The prison stood ready long before its first inmates arrived. Empty corridors echoed to the stone halls. Iron doors remained locked without purpose, and guards spent weeks rehearsing routines that would soon become daily life. Then, on a gray morning, the silence ended. A transport ship appeared through the fog, carrying the men who would become the prison's first occupants. Most had never seen the island before. Chained together on the deck, they watched the fortress slowly emerge from the mist. At first they noticed only the cliffs, then the walls. Finally, the towers overlooking the sea. The closer the ship came, the quieter the prisoners became. Even the most hardened criminals understood they were not arriving at an ordinary prison. They were entering a place built to erase any hope of leaving. As the ship docked, guards immediately separated the prisoners into small groups. Every movement followed a strict routine. Names were recorded. Personal belongings were confiscated. Hair was cut short. Uniforms replaced civilian clothes. Numbers replaced identities. Within a few hours, men who had lived completely different lives now looked almost identical, distinguished only by the expressions on their faces. Some appeared defiant. Others tried to hide their fear. A few stared silently at the sea, realizing it would likely be the last open horizon they would ever see. Older inmates whispered that the ocean itself was another prison wall. Younger prisoners refused to believe it. Many secretly promised themselves they would find a way out. Their first walk through the prison was carefully designed to destroy that confidence. Guards deliberately marched them past thick iron gates, endless corridors, inner walls, watchtowers, and armed sentries. Every locked door revealed another locked door beyond it. Every staircase led to another checkpoint. By the time they reached their cells, most had already understood the message. Escaping would require far more than reaching the outer wall. Life inside began before sunrise. A bell echoed across the prison each morning, followed by inspections, forced labor, meager meals, and constant surveillance. Every minute belonged to the institution. Conversations were monitored. Letters were censored. Punishments were immediate. Discipline was maintained not only through force, but through routine so rigid that many prisoners eventually lost track of days, weeks, and even seasons. Yet something unexpected soon happened. The more impossible the prison seemed, the more inmates became obsessed with escaping it. Some studied guard patrols. Others counted tides from tiny windows. A few secretly memorized the rhythm of supply boats entering and leaving the island. They knew the odds were almost non-existent, but desperation has always been stronger than probability. The prison had succeeded in keeping men confined. It had not succeeded in destroying their desire for freedom. And before long, someone would attempt the impossible. It took less than 3 months for someone to make the first escape attempt. Prison officials had expected inmates to spend years studying the island before acting, but desperation moved faster than experience. One prisoner, convinced that every prison had a weakness, decided he would be the first to find it. He began by observing everything around him. He counted the guards during every shift change. He memorized which gate stayed open the longest. He noticed which officers hurried through inspections and which ones carefully checked every corner. What seemed like meaningless routine to everyone else slowly became valuable information. For weeks he behaved like a model prisoner. He never argued, never broke rules, and never attracted attention. Guards gradually stopped watching him as closely. That was exactly what he wanted. Every unnoticed movement gave him another opportunity to study the prison's rhythm. His plan was remarkably simple. During an evening work assignment near the storage buildings, he slipped behind a stack of wooden crates instead of returning with the others. Hidden in the shadows, he waited motionless while the final prisoner count was completed. Darkness spread across the island, and for a brief moment, he believed he had succeeded. Carefully, he crossed the courtyard and reached the outer wall. Climbing it was harder than expected. The stone was wet from sea spray, and every surface seemed designed to deny a secure grip. After several exhausting minutes, he finally reached the top and looked beyond the prison for the first time since arriving. What he saw immediately changed everything. There was no nearby shoreline, no fishing village, no hidden beach, only black water stretching endlessly beneath the cliffs. The waves crashed against the rocks with terrifying force. Even if he survived the jump, he would still face freezing currents capable of draining his strength within minutes. Standing on that wall, he realized the prison had never depended entirely on guards or locks. Nature had finished the job, but turning back meant certain punishment. Jumping at least offered a chance, however small. He hesitated only a few seconds before throwing himself into the darkness below. Guards heard the splash almost instantly. Searchlights swept across the water as alarm bells echoed through the prison. Boats were launched despite the dangerous sea. For hours they searched between the cliffs, calling his name into the wind. By sunrise they found no body, no clothing, no signs of survival, nothing. Some believed the currents had carried him far out to sea. Others thought he had struck the rocks before disappearing beneath the waves. A handful of prisoners whispered another possibility, that somehow, against every expectation, he had actually escaped. The administration refused to discuss the incident publicly. Official records listed the man simply as lost at sea, yet his disappearance changed the prison forever. Security became even stricter, patrols doubled, inspections intensified, and every inmate learned a powerful lesson. Escaping the prison was only the beginning. Surviving the island was the real challenge. After the first escape attempt, the prison changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. More guards appeared along the walls. Night patrols became longer. Cell inspections grew increasingly thorough, and even the smallest unusual object could lead to punishment. Yet despite the tighter security, daily life settled into a routine that many inmates soon described as more exhausting than physical labor itself. Every morning began before sunrise with the ringing of a heavy iron bell. Within minutes, every prisoner had to stand beside his bed for inspection. Blankets had to be folded with precision. Clothing had to be spotless despite the damp air that seemed to soak everything on the island. Any mistake, however small, could cost valuable privileges. Breakfast was simple and repetitive. Bread, thin porridge, and occasionally dried fish or soup. The meals were never generous, but they were carefully measured. Prison authorities believed hunger discouraged rebellion while still keeping prisoners healthy enough to work. Many inmates spent their days thinking more about their next meal than about freedom. Work occupied nearly every daylight hour. Some cut stone from the island itself. Others repaired walls constantly damaged by wind and salt water. Blacksmiths maintained locks and chains. Carpenters built furniture, repaired docks, and strengthened buildings that never stopped battling the harsh climate. Every task reminded prisoners that they were helping maintain the very place that imprisoned them. The weather became another form of discipline. Cold winds swept through the courtyards, even during warmer months. Thick fog often covered the island for hours, reducing visibility to only a few yards. Winters were especially brutal. Rain mixed with icy air, soaking uniforms that rarely had enough time to dry before the next day's labor. Inside the cell blocks, silence became almost as important as obedience. Conversations were short and cautious, because prisoners never knew who might report them. Nevertheless, friendships slowly formed. Men shared stories about families they had left behind, mistakes they regretted, and dreams they still refused to abandon. These quiet conversations often became the only reminder that life existed beyond the prison walls. Some prisoners marked the passing of time by scratching tiny lines into stone beside their beds. Others counted seasons by watching seabirds nest on nearby cliffs each spring. A few eventually stopped counting altogether. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months, and years into something difficult to measure. For many, the prison's greatest weapon was not fear, but monotony. Even the guards were affected by the island's isolation. Rotations were limited because few officers wanted to remain there longer than necessary. Some admitted privately that they also felt imprisoned. When storms prevented supply ships from arriving, guards and inmates alike found themselves trapped together, equally unable to leave until the sea allowed it. Yet beneath the seemingly predictable routine, another reality was quietly taking shape. Small groups of prisoners had begun exchanging information without attracting attention. They weren't planning another reckless escape like the first one. This time, they intended to prepare for months, and they believed patience would succeed where desperation had failed. The prison administration believed constant surveillance prevented organized escape attempts. Guards watched the prisoners every hour of the day, inspected their cells without warning, and strictly controlled communication between different work crews. What they failed to realize was that observation worked both ways. While the guards studied the inmates were quietly studying the guards. It began with small details that seemed unimportant on their own. One prisoner noticed that a particular watchtower changed guards exactly 5 minutes later than the others. Another realized the supply dock remained unusually busy on delivery days, creating brief moments of confusion. A third discovered that certain doors stayed unlocked just long enough for work crews to move equipment between buildings. None of these observations meant much individually, but together they slowly formed a clearer picture of how the prison truly functioned. Rather than discussing their findings openly, the men developed subtle ways to exchange information. A brief conversation while carrying stone, a scratch symbol on a workshop bench, a seemingly harmless remark during meals. Their words rarely mentioned escape directly. Instead, they spoke about weather, tides, tools, or routines, knowing those subjects conceal far more important meanings. The ocean itself became one of their greatest teachers. Whenever work assignments brought them near the shoreline, they watched the movement of the currents. They noticed how the tide changed throughout the day, where floating debris drifted, and which areas of water appeared calmer during certain hours. Experienced fishermen among the prisoners shared knowledge gathered long before their imprisonment. They warned that the sea surrounding the island was not equally dangerous everywhere. Some routes were almost certainly fatal. Others, while still terrifying, offered a slightly better chance of survival. One inmate became particularly fascinated by the supply boats. Every arrival followed a familiar pattern. Cargo was unloaded in a specific order. Guards temporarily abandoned certain positions to assist the workers. Civilian sailors moved freely through areas prisoners could normally never approach. These moments lasted only minutes, but in a prison where every second was controlled, even a few minutes represented opportunity. The guards noticed none of this because nothing unusual appeared to be happening. The prisoners continued working, obeying orders and returning to their cells without incident. From the administration's perspective, discipline had been fully restored after the first failed escape. Confidence slowly returned. Inspections became slightly less intense. A few experienced officers even began believing the island's reputation alone was enough to discourage further attempts. That confidence would prove dangerous, because unlike the first prisoner who had acted alone, this new generation of inmates understood something far more important. Escaping the prison would never depend on courage alone. It would require planning, patience, and absolute trust between men who had every reason to distrust one another. For months, they said almost nothing, but they never stopped watching. And with every passing week, the impossible began to look just a little less impossible. The prison's walls intimidated every newcomer, but the longer inmates remained on the island, the more they understood an uncomfortable truth. The stone walls were not the prison's greatest defense. The sea was. Many prisoners could barely swim. Even those who had never faced freezing open water with powerful currents pulling in different directions. Veteran sailors working on supply boats often spoke with respect about those waters. They knew the ocean surrounding the island could change within minutes. A calm surface at sunrise could become a deadly storm before noon. Every season brought new dangers. During winter, the water temperature was so low that exhaustion arrived quickly. Hands lost strength. Legs became heavy. Breathing turned painful. Even a healthy man wearing ordinary clothes would struggle to survive for long. During spring, melting snow increased the force of the currents. Summer offered slightly calmer conditions, but thick fog often reduced visibility to almost nothing. In autumn, violent winds returned, making even experienced sailors think twice before leaving the mainland. The prison administration understood this better than anyone. New guards received detailed instructions about the sea before learning the prison itself. They were warned never to underestimate the tides and never to chase escaped prisoners into dangerous waters without proper boats. More than one officer had nearly lost his own life trying to capture someone who had already sealed his own fate by entering the ocean. Several prisoners secretly tested the water. Whenever work brought them near the shoreline, some dipped their hands into the sea for only a few seconds before pulling them back in shock. The cold was unlike anything they had imagined. Others quietly dropped pieces of driftwood into the current and watched how quickly they disappeared from sight. The demonstration required no explanation. If a simple piece would vanish so easily, what chance did a tired, hungry man really have? Stories about failed escape attempts spread from cell to cell. One tale described a prisoner who built a crude floating device from empty barrels. Another claimed two inmates tried swimming together, believing they could encourage one another if one became too weak. Neither story ended with freedom. Whether every detail was true hardly mattered. The stories reinforced what everyone already suspected. Still, hope refused to disappear completely. Among the inmates were former fishermen, sailors, and dock workers who looked at the sea differently. They did not see an impossible barrier. They saw a challenge that demanded knowledge. They studied the tides more carefully than anyone else, memorizing the hours when currents shifted and identifying the rare days when the water seemed less violent. One elderly prisoner quietly remarked that nature never remained exactly the same. Every river changed. Every tide changed. Every storm eventually passed. If the sea had patterns, then perhaps those patterns could be understood. It was only a simple observation, but for a handful of determined prisoners, it became something far more dangerous. For the first time, they stopped asking whether escape was impossible. Instead, they began asking whether they simply hadn't chosen the right moment. No prison in history has ever been so secure that it completely erased the desire for freedom. The island prison was no exception. Every failed escape attempt discouraged the men, but inspired others. Each mistake became a lesson. Each punishment became another reminder that life behind those walls offered little to lose. The administration carefully documented every attempt. Guards recorded missing tools, damaged locks, unusual conversations, and suspicious behavior. They believed these reports would help prevent future escapes. Ironically, the prisoners learned from those failures as well. News traveled quietly through whispers in workshops, kitchens, and exercise yards. Within weeks, almost everyone knew exactly how the last attempt had failed. Some inmates focused on physical preparation. They exercised whenever possible, strengthening muscles weakened by poor food and endless labor. Others collected practical knowledge instead. They learned which guards were strict, which were careless, and which occasionally looked the other way during routine inspections. A few prisoners became experts at repairing ropes, carving wood, or working with metal. Skills that seemed ordinary inside the prison, but could one day mean the difference between life and death. One prisoner spent months memorizing the sound of every bell that echoed through the fortress. Another counted the exact number of footsteps made by the night patrol outside his cell. A former carpenter quietly studied every door hinge he repaired, noticing which ones showed signs of rust and which had recently been replaced. Nothing was considered too small to matter. The guards noticed changes in behavior, but interpreted them incorrectly. Prisoners argued less. Discipline improved. Escape attempts became rare. From the administration's perspective, The prison had finally broken their spirit. What they failed to recognize was that patience often looks exactly like surrender. Even the weather became part of every calculation. Strong winds masked unusual noises. Heavy rain reduced visibility from the towers. Dense fog concealed movement, but also made navigation almost impossible. The prisoners debated endlessly about which danger offered the better chance. Some believed clear nights were safest. Others insisted that only a storm could hide an escape. Meanwhile, life continued exactly as the administration intended. Supply boats arrived. Work assignments changed with the seasons. Guards rotated in and out. New prisoners replaced those who died, completed sentences, or were transferred elsewhere. The prison appeared calm, predictable, and firmly under control. Beneath that calm surface, however, a handful of inmates had already formed an unspoken agreement. If another escape was attempted, it would not rely on luck or impulse. Every detail would be planned in advance. Every participant would know his role. Every risk would be carefully weighed against the almost certain fate awaiting anyone who remained behind. Months of preparation had created something the prison authorities never expected. Not a rebellion, not violence, but quiet determination. And before long, that determination would face its greatest test yet. For nearly 2 years, nothing happened that alarmed the prison authorities. There were no dramatic escape attempts, no major disturbances, and no organized rebellions. To the guards, it seemed the island had finally achieved its purpose. The prisoners had accepted reality. Their routines were predictable. Their discipline had improved, and the fortress appeared more secure than ever. Then came the storm. Old fishermen on the mainland would later describe it as one of the fiercest storms of the decade. Dark clouds covered the coastline before sunset, and by nightfall the sea had transformed into a violent mass of towering waves. Wind slammed against the prison walls with such force that windows rattled throughout the fortress. Rain poured sideways, reducing visibility to only a few feet. Inside the prison, even experienced guards admitted they had never seen weather quite like it. Searchlights struggled to cut through the rain. The watchtowers swayed under powerful gusts, forcing officers to take shelter more often than usual. Communication between different sections of the prison became difficult as the wind swallowed whistles and shouted commands. Most people believed such conditions made escape impossible. A small group of prisoners believed exactly the opposite. For months, they had studied the habits of the guards during storms. They knew that extreme weather forced patrols to shorten their routes. They knew officers naturally focused more on protecting themselves than watching every shadow. They also understood that the crashing waves could hide sounds that would normally echo across the prison yard. That night, every observation they had collected suddenly became valuable. The men exchanged almost no words. They didn't need to. Each already knew where to be and when to move. One distracted a guard during a routine inspection. Another quietly delayed the return of work equipment that had been carefully hidden days earlier. A third watched the corridor outside the workshop, waiting for the exact moment the patrol disappeared into the rain. Everything depended on timing. One mistake would expose them all. The storm itself seemed determined to test every part of their plan. Wind extinguished lanterns. Mud made the courtyards dangerously slippery. Heavy rain soaked clothing within minutes, adding weight to every movement. Yet the same weather that threatened their lives also concealed them better than any darkness ever could. Near midnight, the group reached the outer section of the prison without triggering an alarm. For the first time in years, several prisoners stood only a short distance from the island's cliffs. Beyond them waited the ocean, black, violent, endless. One of the men whispered that turning back was still possible. Another quietly answered that returning to their cells meant spending the rest of their lives wondering whether this had been their only chance. No one spoke again. They stepped toward the edge, knowing the hardest part of the escape had not been leaving the prison. It was about to begin. The men had prepared for nearly a year, yet nothing could truly prepare them for the reality waiting below the cliffs. Standing at the island's edge, they watched enormous waves explode against the rocks before disappearing into darkness. The cold wind cut through their soaked uniforms, and every instinct told them to turn back. Still, they knew another opportunity like this might never come. Using a rope secretly assembled from dozens of stolen fibers, they carefully descended the cliff. The climb was slower than expected. Wet stone offered almost no grip, and more than once someone nearly slipped into the crashing surf below. Every movement demanded complete concentration. Above them, the prison was hidden by rain. Below them, the sea waited without mercy. Reaching the shoreline was only the first victory. Hidden among the rocks was a small raft they had spent months building in secret. It wasn't large enough to carry them comfortably, nor strong enough to inspire confidence. Constructed from salvaged wood, empty barrels, and handmade rope, it represented hundreds of small risks taken over many months. If the guards had discovered even one of those materials, the entire plan would have collapsed. For a brief moment, hope returned. The raft floated, barely. The men pushed away from the rocks, allowing the waves to carry them into open water. At first, everything seemed almost peaceful. The prison slowly disappeared behind sheets of rain, and for the first time since their imprisonment, no walls surrounded them. Then the current changed. Without warning, the raft began drifting sideways instead of away from the island. Powerful water flowing beneath the surface pulled it toward a field of jagged rocks hidden beneath the waves. The prisoners struggled with improvised paddles, but every effort seemed to make little difference. Nature ignored courage. It obeyed only its own laws. A massive wave struck the raft broadside. The entire structure shuddered violently. One barrel broke loose. Another cracked. Water rushed across the wooden platform. The men fought desperately to keep the raft together, tying ropes with freezing hands that had already begun losing feeling. Every passing minute made simple tasks harder. Their fingers became stiff. Their breathing grew heavier. The cold was no longer uncomfortable. It was becoming dangerous. Back on the island, guards finally noticed something was wrong. During the next prisoner count, several cells stood empty. Alarm bells immediately echoed through the fortress. Searchlights swept across the sea, their beams disappearing into the storm. Rescue boats prepared to launch, but experienced officers hesitated. They knew that sending men into those waters could create even more deaths. Far from the island, the escapees could still hear the bells carried faintly by the wind. Some believed they had already won. Others feared the ocean had only begun testing them. Within minutes, the fragile raft started breaking apart, and every man aboard understood the same terrifying truth. The prison was no longer trying to stop them. The sea was. By dawn, the storm had begun to weaken, but the sea remained dangerously rough. The prison administration wasted no time organizing the largest search operation in the island's history. Every available boat was prepared. Experienced sailors joined armed guards, while officers scanned the horizon through telescopes from the highest watchtowers. No one knew whether they were searching for living men, bodies, or simple pieces of broken wood. The authorities faced an uncomfortable problem. If the escapees had survived, news of their success could damage the prison's carefully built reputation. For years, the island had been presented as impossible to escape. One successful attempt could inspire countless others. The search was no longer just about capturing fugitives. It was about protecting the prison's image. The sea, however, refused to cooperate. Floating debris appeared miles from the island, carried by unpredictable currents. A broken plank was found near the northern cliffs. A section of rope surfaced the following afternoon. One of the empty barrels believed to have supported the raft washed ashore on a distant beach several days later. Each discovery suggested the escape had ended in disaster, but none provided a final answer. The prisoners who remained inside the fortress waited anxiously for news. Guards deliberately revealed almost nothing. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed every escapee had drowned within minutes. Others insisted fishermen had secretly rescued survivors before the search boats reached them. With no official explanation, every version sounded equally believable. Meanwhile, local fishing communities became unexpectedly involved. Boats returning from the open sea were questioned by military officers. Captains were asked whether they had seen drifting men or unusual wreckage. Several fishermen admitted spotting objects floating in the water after the storm, but none could say with certainty what they had seen. The ocean had scattered everything too widely. After 3 days, optimism among the search crews began fading. The cold water alone made survival increasingly unlikely. Medical officers explained that even strong swimmers could not endure such conditions for long without protection. Still, the search continued. Hope may have been small, but abandoning it too soon carried political consequences the authorities preferred to avoid. On the fifth day, one patrol boat discovered something unexpected. Wedged between two isolated rocks floated a section of the escape raft. It was badly damaged. Several ropes had snapped. The wooden frame had splintered under enormous force. Yet one detail immediately caught the officer's attention. There was no sign of blood, no clothing, no human remains, only the broken raft itself. The discovery answered one question, but created another. Had the raft simply fallen apart before the prisoners drowned, or had they abandoned it while still alive? Investigators could not agree. Ocean currents were capable of carrying wreckage great distances, making it almost impossible to reconstruct what had truly happened. Weeks later, the official report declared the escapees dead. The case was closed. The prison returned to its routine. But among the inmates, the story never ended, because no one had actually seen the men die. And sometimes, history's greatest mysteries begin with the absence of proof. Once the official investigation ended, the prison administration considered the matter closed. Reports were filed, records archived, and the names of the missing prisoners quietly disappeared from daily conversation. According to the authorities, the island had once again proven impossible to escape. The ocean had claimed those who challenged it, and no further explanation was necessary. But history rarely follows official reports. Among the guards, strange stories slowly began to circulate. One officer claimed he had seen smoke rising from a distant section of the coastline weeks after the escape. Another insisted fisherman had reported finding footprints on an isolated beach where no one was known to live. None of these accounts could be verified, yet they refused to disappear. The fishermen developed their own theories. Having spent their entire lives navigating those waters, they knew the currents better than anyone. Some argued that the storm could have carried the escapees much farther than investigators believed. Others insisted there were small coves and hidden inlets unknown to outsiders, places where exhausted men might have reached land if fortune had favored them. Inside the prison, the story changed with every retelling. Some prisoners became convinced that at least one man had survived. Others believed all of them had died, but admired their courage enough to keep the tale alive. New inmates arrived already familiar with the legend. Before they had even seen their cells, they had heard whispers about the group that had vanished into the storm and was never found again. The administration did everything possible to stop those rumors. Guards punished anyone caught discussing the escape during work assignments. Letters leaving the prison were carefully inspected to prevent the story from spreading. Even official visitors were told only that several dangerous inmates had drowned while attempting an impossible escape. Ironically, the effort to suppress the story only made it more powerful. Silence invited imagination, and imagination filled every unanswered question. Years passed, but the mystery refused to fade. Sailors occasionally claimed to have seen abandoned campsites on remote stretches of coastline. Hunters reported finding crude shelters deep in nearby forests. Every discovery sparked fresh speculation, yet no evidence was ever strong enough to reopen the investigation. Historians studying the prison decades later encountered the same problem. The official records declared the escape a complete failure, but surviving witness accounts often contradicted one another. Some documents contained unexplained gaps. Certain pages appeared to have been removed entirely. A few names mentioned in early reports vanished from later versions without explanation. Whether this resulted from poor record-keeping or deliberate censorship remains uncertain. What is certain is that the attempted escape transformed the prison forever. It was no longer remembered only as a fortress surrounded by water. It had become a place where history itself seemed unwilling to reveal the whole truth. And that mystery would follow the island for generations. The mysterious escape did not weaken the prison's reputation. If anything, it strengthened it. Officials used the incident as proof that even the boldest attempt ended in disappearance. New prisoners arrived already convinced that the island offered no real path to freedom. The message was simple. People could try to escape, but the sea would always finish what the prison began. As the years passed, the number of inmates steadily increased. New cell blocks were added to accommodate growing populations, and additional guard towers appeared along the cliffs. Workshops expanded, storage buildings multiplied, and the docks were reinforced to handle larger supply ships. What had once been a relatively isolated fortress slowly became a small, self-contained community dedicated entirely to confinement. Life inside followed an almost mechanical rhythm. Ships arrived with food, coal, medicine, and equipment. Others departed carrying official reports, completed prison records, and, occasionally, prisoners whose sentences had ended. For many inmates, watching those boats disappear beyond the horizon became the most painful moment of each week. Every departing vessel represented a world that continued moving without them. Generations of guards also passed through the island. Young recruits arrived believing they had been assigned to one of the safest prisons in the country. Veterans left carrying stories they rarely shared with outsiders. Many admitted that the isolation affected everyone, not only the prisoners. Weeks of fog, endless wind, and the constant sound of crashing waves created a strange sense of separation from ordinary life. The island itself never stopped demanding repairs. Salt slowly ate away at iron bars. Wooden docks cracked beneath harsh winters. Storms regularly damaged walls facing the sea. Maintenance became a permanent task rather than an occasional necessity. Ironically, much of that work continued to be performed by the prisoners themselves, who spent years preserving the very institution that denied them their freedom. Some inmates eventually accepted their fate. Others never stopped dreaming of escape, even if they no longer planned it. They stood for long periods staring through narrow windows toward the mainland, imagining families they had not seen in years. New prisoners often spoke about freedom with confidence. Older inmates usually remained silent. Experience had taught them that hope could become both a source of strength and a source of suffering. Outside the prison, however, the world was beginning to change. New technologies improved transportation. Laws evolved. Governments reconsidered older systems of punishment. Across the country, debates emerged about whether remote island prisons still represented justice or merely symbols of another era. At first, those discussions seemed distant and unimportant. The guards continued their patrols. The bells continued ringing. The waves continued striking the cliffs exactly as they always had. Yet history was quietly moving toward the island, and for the first time since the prison had been built, its future was no longer certain. For decades, the island prison had seemed untouchable. Governments changed, laws evolved, and entire generations came and went, yet the fortress remained exactly where it had always stood, facing the sea with the same imposing silence. To many people, it felt permanent, as though it had existed forever and would continue existing forever. But history has a habit of changing even the institutions that appear impossible to replace. Across the country, new ideas about justice began gaining support. Politicians, judges, and legal scholars questioned whether prisons should exist only to isolate people or whether they should also prepare them to return to society. Public opinion slowly shifted. Punishment alone no longer satisfied everyone. Rehabilitation became part of the national conversation. The island prison soon found itself at the center of that debate. Critics argued that its isolation made meaningful rehabilitation nearly impossible. Families struggled to visit because the journey across the water was expensive and dangerous. Lawyers found access difficult during harsh weather. Medical emergencies depended entirely on the arrival of boats, and even routine supplies could be delayed for days whenever storms closed the sea. Economic concerns also became impossible to ignore. Maintaining a prison on a remote island demanded enormous resources. Every shipment of food, coal, medicine, building materials, and equipment required specialized transport. Every repair cost more than it would on the mainland. Even replacing a simple piece of machinery often involved weeks of planning. What had once been considered an investment in security was increasingly viewed as an expensive burden. At the same time, advances in prison design offered alternatives. New correctional facilities built closer to major cities used reinforced concrete, modern surveillance systems, and improved transportation networks. Officials argued they could provide equal security without depending on nature as their primary defense. Gradually, conversations about the prison's future became more serious. Some proposed reducing the number of inmates. Others suggested transforming the island into a military installation. A few even recommended abandoning the prison altogether. For the guards who had spent years there, the discussions felt almost unreal. Many had built entire careers on the island. Some had raised families in nearby staff housing. The idea that the fortress could one day stand empty seemed difficult to imagine. The prisoners reacted differently. Some hardly believed the rumors. Others refused to hope, convinced they had heard false promises before. Yet each passing year brought subtle changes that everyone could see. Fewer prisoners arrived. Certain buildings were no longer repaired as quickly. Several work areas closed permanently. Without any official announcement, the prison began shrinking. Its long history was approaching its final chapter, although almost no one living there realized it. The island that had once symbolized permanence was quietly preparing for something it had never experienced before: silence. By the time officials finally approved the prison's gradual closure, the island no longer resembled a place that had terrified generations of inmates. The walls were still imposing. The watchtowers still overlooked the sea, and the waves still crashed relentlessly against the cliffs. But something had changed. The constant movement that had once defined the fortress had slowed noticeably. Fewer prisoners remained. Entire cell blocks stood empty for the first time in decades. Corridors that had echoed with footsteps every morning now remained silent for hours. Workshops that once employed hundreds of inmates operated with only a handful of men. Some buildings were locked permanently, no longer considered necessary. The prison was not collapsing. It was simply fading away. Transfers to mainland prisons became increasingly common. Rather than sending new inmates to the island, authorities relocated those who still had many years left to serve. One by one, prison ships carried them away. For many, it was the first time they had seen the mainland in years. Some barely recognized the towns they had left behind. Roads had changed. Harbors had expanded. Entire generations had grown up while they remained isolated behind stone walls. Those approaching the end of their sentences experienced mixed emotions. Freedom, once imagined every day, suddenly felt unfamiliar. Some had spent so many years inside the prison that ordinary life seemed almost intimidating. They worried about finding work, rebuilding relationships, and adapting to a world that had continued moving without them. The guards faced similar uncertainty. Many had served on the island for most of their careers. They knew every corridor, every tower, and every section of the shoreline by memory. Transfers to mainland prisons meant leaving behind not only their workplace, but an entire way of life. Some welcomed the change. Others admitted they would miss the strange routine that had shaped so many years of their lives. As the population decreased, daily routines became quieter. The morning bell still rang, but fewer footsteps answered it. Meals were served in nearly empty dining halls. Evening lockups took only minutes instead of hours. The prison that had once held hundreds of inmates now felt far larger than necessary. One elderly prisoner, who had spent more than 3 decades on the island, reportedly made a remark that several guards later remembered. Looking toward the sea, he quietly said that the island had never really belonged to prison. The prison only borrowed it. His words stayed with those who heard them. Long before the fortress had been built, the waves had ruled those cliffs. Long after the last prisoner departed, they would continue doing exactly the same. Eventually, only a small number of inmates remained. Everyone knew the end was close. No one could have imagined how emotional that final departure would become. Because closing a prison was one thing. Saying goodbye to a place that had defined thousands of lives was something entirely different. The final day arrived with surprising simplicity. There was no grand ceremony, no military parade, and no celebration. After decades of operating without interruption, the island prison reached the end of its purpose almost quietly, as though history itself wished to close the chapter with dignity rather than spectacle. Before sunrise, the remaining prisoners packed the few belongings they were still allowed to keep. Most carried little more than a change of clothing, a handful of letters, and small personal items collected over many years. The possessions were modest, but for men who had lived under constant restrictions, they represented entire lifetimes. The guards followed their usual routine one last time. Morning inspection, roll call, breakfast. Everything happened exactly as it always had. except everyone understood that none of it would ever happen again. When the transport ship arrived at the dock, silence spread across the island. Even the officers who had maintained strict discipline for years seemed unusually reflective. They watched as the last inmates walked toward the pier, no longer surrounded by the tension that had once defined every transfer. There was no urgency, no shouting, no resistance, only quiet footsteps. Several prisoners paused before boarding the ship, not because they wanted to remain, but because after spending decades staring at those walls, leaving them behind felt strangely unreal. Some looked toward the cliffs where they had once dreamed of escaping. Others glanced at the watchtowers that had dominated every day of their imprisonment. One man removed his cap for a brief moment, silently acknowledging the place that had taken so much of his life. The ship slowly pulled away from the dock. For years, prisoners had watched vessels disappear toward the horizon while remaining trapped behind stone walls. Now they were finally aboard one. As the distance grew, the prison gradually shrank against the landscape. From the sea, it once again resembled what sailors had seen generations earlier, a lonely fortress standing against endless water. Without the sound of work crews, bells, and marching boots, the island appeared strangely peaceful. Back on shore, only a small maintenance crew remained. Their task was simple: secure the buildings, lock every entrance, and prepare the fortress for abandonment. Late that afternoon, the prison's massive front gate was closed one final time. The iron lock that had confined thousands of people over so many years clicked into place, not to keep prisoners inside, but because there were no prisoners left. The guards gathered briefly outside the entrance before leaving the island themselves. Some took one last look at the towers. Others avoided turning around altogether. Within hours, the prison stood completely empty. For the first time since its construction, no voices echoed to the corridors. No footsteps crossed the courtyards. No light shone behind the iron bars. Only the wind remained. And the sea, which had patiently guarded the island long before the prison existed, quietly reclaimed its silence. Once the last boat disappeared beyond the horizon, the island entered a silence unlike anything it had experienced before. For decades, every hour had been marked by bells, footsteps, shouted orders, and the constant movement of guards and prisoners. Now there was nothing except the wind crossing empty courtyards and waves breaking endlessly against the cliffs. Nature wasted no time reclaiming what humanity had built. Within a few years, salt carried by the sea began eating away at iron railings that had once seemed indestructible. Wooden doors swelled with moisture. Windows cracked under relentless storms. Moss spread across stone walls that had been scrubbed clean for generations. Weeds pushed through narrow cracks in the courtyards where hundreds of prisoners had once marched in perfect formation. Seabirds quickly returned. Many nested on abandoned watchtowers where armed guards had once stood day and night. Their cries echoed through the empty fortress, replacing the whistles and commands that had filled the island for so long. Visitors later remarked that it was difficult to imagine such a peaceful place had once represented fear for thousands of people. Historians eventually became interested in preserving the prison rather than simply abandoning it. They recognized that the fortress represented far more than an old correctional facility. It told the story of an entire philosophy of justice, one built on isolation, endurance, and the belief that distance itself could become a form of punishment. Old documents were recovered from government archives. Construction plans revealed how carefully every building had been designed. Guard reports described ordinary days that no newspaper had ever considered important. Prison registers preserved the names of people who otherwise would have vanished from history completely. Researchers also interviewed former guards and surviving prisoners. Their memories often differed in surprising ways. A guard might remember a certain winter as unusually calm, while a prisoner recalled it as the harshest season of his life. Some described strict discipline, but fair treatment. Others remembered endless loneliness more vividly than any punishment. These conflicting memories reminded historians of an important truth. Buildings preserve facts. People preserve emotions. Both are necessary to understand the past. Visitors walking through the abandoned prison today often pause inside the cells. The rooms seem remarkably small. The thick stone walls absorb almost every sound. Standing there for only a few minutes offers a glimpse of the isolation experienced by those who spent years inside. Many also walked to the cliffs overlooking the sea. From that viewpoint, the true reason for choosing the island becomes immediately obvious. The ocean stretches in every direction. The mainland feels impossibly distant. Even now, with modern boats and navigation, the island retains an unmistakable sense of separation from the rest of the world. Time changed the prison, but it never changed the sea that made the prison possible. Although the prison closed its gates forever, one question never disappeared. Did anyone ever truly escape? For decades, historians searched through prison records, government correspondence, newspaper archives, and personal diaries, hoping to find a definitive answer. The deeper they looked, the more confusing the story became. Official documents insisted every escape attempt had failed, yet several reports contained inconsistencies that were difficult to ignore. One archive listed a prisoner as presumed drowned. Another described the same man simply as missing. A later report omitted his name entirely. Small differences like these may seem insignificant, but to historians they often signal that not every detail survived the passage of time. Former guards offered conflicting memories as well. Some insisted the island's currents made survival absolutely impossible. Others admitted there were rare days when the sea became unexpectedly calm, allowing experienced fishermen to travel safely through waters normally considered deadly. Neither side could prove its claim. Former prisoners added even more uncertainty. Years after their release, several recalled hearing rumors that one member of the famous escape group had reached the mainland with help from local fishermen. None claimed to have witnessed it personally. Every account came from someone who had heard it from someone else. Even so, the story refused to disappear. Researchers eventually began examining weather records from a night of the Great Storm. Surprisingly, they discovered that after the storm's strongest winds passed, ocean conditions briefly improved before worsening again the following day. That short window fascinated historians. Could it have been enough? Could exhausted prisoners drifting on broken pieces of their raft have survived long enough to reach calmer water? No one knows. Modern maritime experts remain divided. Some argue survival would have been extraordinarily unlikely because of the freezing temperatures. Others point out that history contains remarkable examples of people surviving conditions once believed impossible. Without physical evidence, certainty remains beyond reach. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether someone escaped. Perhaps it is why so little evidence survived. Records disappear. Witnesses die. Memories change. The ocean erases almost everything it touches. That is why the island prison continues fascinating visitors more than a century later. It represents one of history's oldest unanswered questions, not because we know exactly what happened, but because we probably never will. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones history cannot completely explain. History has produced countless prisons, yet only a small number continue capturing the public imagination long after they have closed. The island fortress belongs to that rare group. It is remembered not because it was the largest or the oldest, but because it represented something deeper than walls, guards, and iron bars. It demonstrated how geography itself could become part of a prison sentence. Every visitor who arrives on the island experiences the same realization within minutes. Photographs never fully capture the isolation. Maps cannot convey the feeling of standing on a cliff surrounded by endless water. Only by hearing the wind, watching the waves crash below, and seeing the mainland reduced to a distant outline does the prison's true design become clear. The builders understood human psychology as well as architecture. They knew that hopelessness could be as effective as stone walls. Every prisoner who looked toward the horizon faced the same impossible question. Even if I escaped these cells, where would I go next? That question haunted generations. Modern historians often describe the prison as a turning point in the evolution of correctional systems. It reflected an era when society believed isolation itself could solve crime. Distance became punishment. Separation became discipline. The island was expected to erase any possibility of return. Today, those ideas are viewed differently. Many former prisons have become museums, educational sites, and historical landmarks rather than places of confinement. Instead of keeping people inside, they now invite visitors to enter freely and learn from the past. The same corridors that once echoed with chains now echo with quiet conversations between historians, students, and travelers curious about lives once lived behind those walls. Standing inside one of the empty cells, it becomes impossible not to think about the men who occupied them. Some were dangerous criminals. Others were ordinary people shaped by desperate circumstances. Regardless of their crimes, each experienced the same cold winds, the same endless sea, and the same uncertain future. That is perhaps the prison's greatest lesson. History is never only about buildings. It is about people. Every stone in the fortress witnessed fear, hope, regret, courage, loneliness, and resilience. Every corridor carried stories that official records could never fully preserve. Even after the prison closed, those human experiences remained embedded within its walls. The island no longer imprisons anyone, yet it continues holding something that cannot be locked away: memory. And as long as people continue asking what really happened there, the prison itself will never truly disappear from history. Today, the prison stands as more than a forgotten fortress surrounded by water. It has become a silent witness to an era when governments believed the perfect prison was one that nature itself would defend. Time has worn down its walls, storms have darkened its stones, and countless winters have passed across its empty courtyards. Yet the island continues telling its story to anyone willing to listen. Visitors often arrive expecting to see nothing more than old buildings. Instead, they find something far more powerful. Walking through the abandoned corridors, it becomes easy to imagine the sound of iron doors closing, the echo of boots across the stone floors, and the distant bell announcing another day that looked exactly like the one before. The silence almost feels alive. Standing inside one of the cells, another realization slowly appears. The room itself is not particularly large. The walls are not impossibly thick. The door is no longer locked. Yet the overwhelming feeling of isolation remains. Looking through the small window toward the endless sea, it becomes obvious why so many prisoners lost hope long before completing their sentences. Outside, the cliffs remain exactly as they were when the first prisoners arrived. Waves continue crashing against the rocks with the same relentless force. The tides still shift without warning. Fog still rolls across the water, hiding the island from the mainland just as it did generations ago. Nature has changed remarkably little. That may be the greatest lesson this prison leaves behind. Human institutions rise and fall. Governments change. Laws evolve. Buildings are constructed and eventually abandoned. But the landscape often outlives them all. The island existed long before the prison was imagined. It remained after the last prisoner departed. And it will likely remain long after every document, photograph, and official record has faded into history. Perhaps that is why the prison continues fascinating people around the world. It reminds us that history is not only preserved in books or museums. Sometimes it survives in places, in winds that still follow the same paths, in waves that continue striking the same cliffs, in walls that refuse to collapse despite decades of abandonment. Whether anyone truly escaped may never be answered with complete certainty. Whether every official report told the whole truth may remain forever unknown. Some mysteries belong to history. Others belong to the sea. If you ever find yourself standing on the shore facing that lonely island, looking toward the fortress rising above the cliffs, you may discover something unexpected. The prison no longer holds prisoners, but it still holds questions. And perhaps that is why its story continues to endure. Not because it was impossible to escape, but because it proved that some places never release the imagination of those who learn their history.